Today we have Dr. Pierre Elias, Cardiology Fellow at New York Presbyterian Hospital and Columbia University Irving Medical Center, Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons, and also a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Biomedical Informatics. Pierre is known for writing in the Washington Post, appearing on Vice News and on CNN, and being a STAT 2020 Wonderkind, all for his work around cardiology and deep learning that he's going to tell us about today. So thank you so much, Pierre.
I'm mostly known for being Jaan's friend. That's, I think, the most important of all of my many illustrious titles. Thank you so much, Jaan. So thank you all very much for having me. It's a pleasure to get to speak with you. My goal here is to talk a little bit about some of the interesting and exciting work that I think is going on here at Columbia and NYP, and hopefully use it as a bridge to get to learn more about other exciting work that's going on in the Morningside campus, find ways to collaborate, potentially find people who are interested in working on this as postdocs or in other roles. And so I really see this as an invitation to say, this is some of the exciting stuff we're doing. What are you guys working on? And is there a place where we should be getting to know each other a little better? These are my disclosures. And I'm just going to go ahead and start talking a little bit about why I think machine learning and deep learning, which I'm going to really use interchangeably during this talk, matter in cardiology. So the first thing is, as I started thinking about the ways that we use machine learning and deep learning and what has been kind of impactful in medicine, I really kind of made a singular clear division, which is if you're using tabular data, and in the medical world, this is a lot of the stuff that we would find in the electronic health record. So these are things like age, laboratory values, demographics. If you have that sort of data, machine learning, at least in medicine, has been rarely significantly better than traditional stats. And I think this is for a couple of reasons. The first is this is very well-featured data. We already know that if you're older rather than younger, you're much more likely to be at risk of certain diseases. We already know what an abnormal troponin or sodium level is because we created the laboratory values to have very clear demarcations of what's normal and abnormal. And so oftentimes, the effort that's required to implement machine learning isn't really worth the additional benefit that you get, the additional 1 or 2% accuracy compared to traditional statistics. And really what I've seen is these sorts of problems, oftentimes there's already some sort of risk score, whether it's a logistic regression model or something that exists. And really the challenge is no one's even using that. And so when you see that, that's much more of a workflow problem. And I think we have many and many of those in medicine. Now, that being said, there is a role for machine learning, or really all forms of AI computation for automating analyses. So places where there is a clearer, better answer, but we don't actually have the time or energy in order to use what currently exists. That's a place where machine learning or other forms of automation can be beneficial. Now, I think medical imaging is very different. So there, the features are poorly known, and traditional statistics doesn't work very well. So if we think about something like an electrocardiogram, which is when we measure the electrical activity across the surface of the chest from the heart, that alone has 60,000 data points, and lots of it doesn't even have a name in medicine. The same thing is true ad infinitum for CT scans, MRI, so on and so forth. And frankly, in medicine, we have this long history of creating a new technology like the CAT scan, and over years and decades, really understanding the modality better and coming up with names of specific patterns that we've discovered that mean certain things on that imaging test. So I think really for the last 30 to 50 years, we've created complex imaging, and really all we've had is the human eye as a way to distinguish pathology from a lack of pathology. And we haven't had excellent methodology that allows us to use all this computational analysis that's been coming around. So I think imaging is a place where machine learning can have a huge impact. We've also seen in cardiology specifically some very fascinating studies that have come out. So the ability to predict abnormal heart rhythms while someone is in a normal heart rhythm from an electrocardiogram, being able to do something that echocardiographers and echocardiographic techs, so people who kind of do ultrasounds of people's hearts, being able to automatically recreate what those people with high levels of skill are able to do by looking at how well the heart squeezes from clips of the heart from an ultrasound, and then outperforming a lot of the traditional risk scores and trying to predict 1 year and 5-year cardiovascular mortality. This was a really interesting study that came out of China. So what they did is they looked at these kind of imperceptible changes in the color of our face when we have more oxygenated or deoxygenated blood. So when our heart is beating, it delivers, more red blood versus blue blood or deoxygenated blood. And so when you're able to look at that over a period of time, they were able to recreate the pattern of the heart beating just from videos of people's faces. And so they trained a deep learning model to detect who had regular or irregular heartbeats. And the most common cause of an irregular heartbeat is atrial fibrillation. And so they were able to detect this abnormal heart rhythm in a cardiology clinic waiting room with over 90% sensitivity and specificity. So there's some really exciting and interesting things going on right now. And we're seeing this kind of merger of all of the vision-based deep learning technologies that have been developed in the last 20 years, kind of starting to come into medicine in a meaningful way. So we believe that deep learning models are going to fundamentally change how we order, acquire, and review medical imaging over the next decade. And here at NYP in Columbia, we're trying to build a world-leading center that develops, validates, and deploys deep learning models for early disease detection. So I want to talk a little bit about some of these kind of initiatives that we've been building here. So the first thing was we had to lay down the pipes. When I started working on this, we had all of these different cardiac information systems that host different types of imaging data that we have. And they weren't connected, and we had immense amounts of data, but we hadn't really organized or thought through it. So the first thing we did was created CRADL, which is this cardiovascular and radiologic deep learning environment. And to date, it has over 1 million ultrasounds of the heart or echocardiograms, 9 million electrocardiograms, tens of thousands of stress tests, a small smattering of chest x-rays with many more coming, and over 150,000 cardiac catheterizations from what is largely considered to be one of the best cath labs in the world. It includes both the tabular data as well as the images themselves. And one of the important things that we've been trying to do is harmonize this to work across a range of applications from a range of institutions. So here at New York Presbyterian, we have Columbia University, we have Cornell University, and then we also have 8 other hospitals across New York City and upstate New York that are affiliated. And so slowly what we've been trying to do is actually create a harmonized platform that incorporates data from these different places. So we can understand, does this deep learning model not only work here, but does it work across town or upstate, and hopefully across the country. And we've built implementations of this on our research service here at Columbia, as well as on Azure and Google Cloud Compute. So when we have people who are, for example, master's students at the Data Science Institute on the Morningside campus have worked with us. And so they can't have access to all of the data, but we can create de-identified versions and get them access to a GCP cluster. Or we've even had people who are taking sabbatical from industry come and work with us. And so this allows them an opportunity to be able to work with us, work with the data, and do interesting work without having too many stopgaps in place that prevent that. So when you think about a lot of the AI papers that are coming out in medicine, this is kind of the traditional paradigm. You have some model that currently exists that is maybe 70% as good as a human expert in trying to do something like detect pneumonia from a chest x-ray. And then you've created a new model, and your new model is 80% as good as the human expert. And so, this idea is that the human expert's interpretation is the gold standard, and your new model is a little closer to that human expert than the current state of the art. And that's oftentimes kind of the incremental approach that we see. We think that there's actually a lot of very interesting and meaningful problems in medicine where the human expert, like me as a cardiologist, is actually worse than an AI model can do. So instead, what we do is, instead of using the human expert, we take some upstream, more expensive, but more accurate diagnostic test, and then we train the model using that as the label. And then we think we can build models that actually outperform human experts. So I'll give you an example of this. So one of our projects is called ValveNet, where we try to detect moderate to severe valvular disease from the heart. So aortic stenosis is one of these types of valvular diseases. And so one of the major valves in your heart gets tight, and it can become life-threatening if it becomes too tight. Your valves can also become leaky, and we call that regurgitation. All of cardiology is either being a plumber or being an electrician. You do one or the other or both, but it really kind of comes down to those things. So this is heavy on the plumbing side. So normally we detect this sort of valvular disease and diagnose it with an ultrasound of the heart, which is called an echocardiogram. So you can see here a sonographer has an ultrasound probe and is putting it on someone's chest, and then is generating these kind of 2D images of the heart. And then they're able to look at the valves, and we can look at the velocities and figure out, is there something wrong with it? Now, this is an expensive test. This costs anywhere from $500 to $3,000 to be done. Electrocardiograms, though, where we measure the surface electrical activity of the heart, which you can see here. So these are the squiggly lines you see on TV all the time. These we do a lot more of and are a lot cheaper. So for every one echocardiogram we do at NYP, we have 9 to 10 electrocardiograms that we do. And an electrocardiogram costs around $40 to $50. So they're much cheaper, they're much more prevalent. But I, as a cardiologist, cannot detect aortic stenosis or other valvular heart disease just looking at an electrocardiogram. So what we did is we took all the electrocardiograms done on patients who also had echocardiograms done within a certain amount of time of one another. And then we generated labels of, this is what an electrocardiogram of someone with valvular heart disease looks like versus someone without. And then we trained a model on that to try and detect what a human expert couldn't. So our goal was to develop a deep learning model which analyzes electrocardiograms to detect patients with left-sided, moderate to severe valvular heart disease. And that included aortic stenosis, aortic regurgitation, mitral regurgitation, and the primary endpoint was any of the 3 above being present. We took data across NYP, so from 4 different hospitals, New York Presbyterian Allen, which is one of our community hospitals, Columbia Irving, which is Milstein Hospital, which is where I practice, and then also adult patients from Morgan Stanley Children's Hospital of New York. And then we had those 3 sites be combined to create our train, validation, and test sets. And what's important is that no patient could show up in any one of the other sets. So the patient was either designated to train, validation, or test. And then we also had a 4th site, another community hospital, that was a kind of a tertiary holdout site test. So our primary data here is electrocardiographic waveforms. So to give you an idea, we measure the surface electrical activity of the heart, putting a couple of different stickers on the chest. And what you generate is a waveform. And you generate 12 separate channels of waveform data. And it's measured at 250 hertz. And it's about 10 seconds long. And so that's a very interesting type of data when you think about image-based artificial intelligence. So at initial pass, you could say, well, there's a lot of that looks like audio data, right? It's waveforms. And, we could go for something like WaveNet or LSTMs or recurrent neural networks where there's this clear temporal component to it. It's waveform based. And so those sorts of models may be best. The other aspect, though, is, compared to a lot of audio data oftentimes is usually passed in as a single channel, not 12 channels. And it's sampled at somewhere between 20 and 40,000 hertz. Well, this is kind of much slower at 250 hertz. And there's kind of this repeating pattern to it because it's measuring 10 seconds, but really, your heart beats every second or so. And so you actually kind of have this repeating pattern where there's maybe 1 second of salient information that gets repeated over and over again. So the alternative was also thinking about convolutional neural networks, both 1-dimensional and 2-dimensional convolutional neural networks, and all the various work that's happened there. And then, you could go beyond that and think about transformers and some of the more interesting things that have been coming out lately. And so we were left with kind of a conundrum, which is what is the best fundamental architecture for this sort of work? And the answer when, we talk with really smart people is, why don't you just try it all and see? So we spent a long time really trying to think through this, creating some experiments around it, but also just trying a lot of different things. So we tried recurrent neural nets, we tried LSTMs, we also tried, more engineering-based approaches like Fourier transforms. And then we tried convolutional neural networks. And we ultimately settled on convolutional neural nets. And I'd like to say that there's a perfect reason why we thought this kind of performed best. But But really what we saw is we saw increased stability using convolutional neural networks. And we saw that we could get away with less computational power, so kind of smaller total size models with fewer trainable parameters. I think this probably has more to do with the fact that convolutional neural networks have been popular for a while, and so we have a lot of different robust architectures that are built around it. So we ultimately focused on residual blocks. We tried models that were inception-based all the way up to 50 million trainable parameters, down to really, really simple residual blocks or dense blocks. And we found somewhere in the middle was kind of the right answer. So this is the ValveNet model. It takes an input of 2500 by 12. So 250 hertz for 10 seconds gives you length 2500 with 12 channels. And then basically there's a set of residual blocks that are repeating with then a combination of adaptive average pooling and max pooling. And then lastly, we do include some tabular data. So things that are included on the electrocardiogram at kind of the top. So like their age, their sex, and then these kind of specific measurements that we make from the electrocardiogram. And this was kind of the model that we ended up finding a lot of success with and allowed us for a lot of kind of training and adaptation over time, because it was relatively nimble. It was only 500,000 trainable parameters. And so this is kind of the ValveNet model and what it looks like to date. I'm going to skip over this information right now, but really just to say, we found appropriate splits between train, validation, and test as far as the parameters go. But then that fourth holdout test site, NYP Lawrence, was quite different. So they were a much older patient population, which just goes to show that different hospitals are going to have a different mix of patients, and that can have a really big impact on how your model performs. So this was the ValveNet's model's performance on our test set. So we had AUROCs anywhere from 0.79 to 0.87 on 26,000 unique patients, where our primary endpoint, which is the presence of any of these moderate to severe valvular diseases, was around 0.83. The other thing we looked at was how does the model perform when you kind of substratify? So we found very similar performance for men and women, but we did find that the model performance degrades as you start looking at older patients. Now, what's interesting about this is when you think about this disease process, it's much more prevalent in patients who are older. So why should the AUROC go down? And the reason is because it's really easy to make your AUROC look great when you're looking at a very healthy population where most people are completely normal. Then the abnormals really stick out in a bigger way. But when you start looking at older populations, these are people who have more disease pathologies, and thus it becomes a little less clear if the pathology you're looking at is valvular heart disease versus something else. The signal to noise ratio is just going to get worse. But you have to find a patient population where the prevalence is high enough, where your positive predictive value or your precision is going to be meaningful. Otherwise, you built a model that looks nice on paper, but it's never going to work in the real world. So to this effect, we had to think about how do we build models that are meaningful and impactful and thus usable in the real world. So the challenge here is when we think about the prevalence of these diseases, we don't know exactly what it's going to be in our population. And what we need to do is we need to build a model that convinces doctors that they should use it. And really kind of in deep learning version 1.0, we think the thing that matters is I wanted to be able to go up to a colleague and say, listen, I ran this model on all of your patients and 10 of them got flagged positive. The positive predictive value of the model is around 30%. So can we send all 10 of those patients for another diagnostic test, which may have costs or risks associated with it, to try and find 3 patients that do have the disease? And that really was kind of the fundamental way we were thinking about it. It's okay if we don't detect everyone, but we need to have a positive predictive value that's good enough where we can compel doctors to really believe that this is something that's of benefit to their patients rather than harm. So in order to do that, you have to know what the prevalence is. And what we did was we modeled the prevalence, or the AUPRC, for a range of prevalences, anywhere from 0.5% to 10% of the data set. And we looked at what would our positive predictive value or our precision be at various recall thresholds. And we wanted to look at this and say, okay, is there a place where we felt this model could work? And we said, basically, if we only needed to catch the top 20% of all patients with disease, and the prevalence level was around 2% in the population that we were looking at, then we'd have a positive predictive value of around 18 to 20%. And that would be good enough for the model to be compelling to use in a larger population. And so for us, this was the sort of work that was actually really, really important before we moved forward to the next steps. I'm gonna not talk about saliency mapping here too much, but to say, I think we have a really long way to go in how we interpret these models. And we did do some saliency mapping here. And the more we use different saliency mapping approaches, the more we felt like we were just running a Rorschach test. And we were just looking magically for whatever we were convinced was an explanation for what was going on. But we'll come back to saliency mapping in a little bit. So we ran a successful retrospective analysis with 4 hospitals' data. We showed the model could work well, and we started to understand what the precision recall curves really looked like in the real world. So we went ahead with the next step, and this is what we're currently doing. And we're very excited to be doing this at Columbia and across NYP. So we ran the model on 35,000 patients who were above the age of 65 with no history of valvular heart disease and had never undergone an echocardiogram, or at least had not had one in the last 5 years, and did have an electrocardiogram in our system. And we ran the model and got a risk score for all of them. And we're actively enrolling 200 patients in a prospective clinical trial to bring them in for an echocardiogram and determine, does this model actually work prospectively in the real world? And the concept here is pretty simple. At a place like Columbia or New York Presbyterian, you have a lot of people coming in for maybe a specific problem. Like they came in for a routine knee replacement and they got an electrocardiogram done as part of the workup before they went to the surgery. But no one ever, listened to their heart with a stethoscope or thought too much about that electrocardiogram. They were looking for one specific piece of information. They didn't see anything too alarming, and so be it. But there may be something else that's going on with that patient that is yet to be undetected. And so with that in mind, we really believe there's this opportunity to look at it from like a health systems level and find patients who may have undetected disease and catch them while they're being treated for these other things that they may have been brought in for. So this is what we're doing right now. We're excited to see how it's going to go. It's really challenging to recruit patients in this way, particularly during COVID, but we've recruited around 10 to 15 patients and we're continuing to call patients. So hopefully the next time I get a chance to talk with people here, we can tell you the results of this trial. We also do something very similar for another diagnosis in medicine called cardiac amyloidosis. So this was a medical diagnosis that was really frustrating for decades. So it's a protein folding disorder where a specific protein called transthyretin or prealbumin misfolds in your body. And when it misfolds, it ends up getting deposited in your organs. And one of the organs you can get deposited in is your heart. And this is a slow burn, long-standing disease. It starts as soon as you're born, and then you don't really see symptoms from it until you're in your 60s or 70s. That being said, what made it so frustrating and challenging was people would present with heart failure where their heart was not working well. And we would give them all the traditional therapies, and they wouldn't really get better. And we would try to diagnose it with all the traditional modalities, and we wouldn't get an answer. And then we would just kind of watch these patients get worse and worse and worse. And then they would get to this point where they were really sick and someone would finally refer them to an academic medical center like Columbia. Then we'd say, well, has anyone thought about cardiac amyloid? And then we would do the specialized tests for it. And we would find out, yes, they have the diagnosis. But by that point, they were in florid heart failure and they would either need a heart transplant or they were going to die from the disease. What was doubly challenging about it is we didn't have good therapies. So a lot of people said, yeah, we should try and diagnose this, but who cares? Columbia has actually been at the forefront for this disease for the last decade. So we created the first non-invasive way to diagnose this test called the pyrophosphate scan. And we also wrote the New England Journal paper for the first medication that actually showed a mortality benefit for patients with cardiac amyloid called tafamidis. And the idea behind this medicine was it could stabilize these tetrameric proteins. So it could stop the disease in its track, but you had to get to the patient before they were in florid heart failure. So you had to find them somewhat early on in the disease course. They could still have heart failure and some symptoms, but you needed to catch them before they had stage 3 or stage 4 heart failure. and no screening test is available for this, this diagnosis. And that kind of remains the holy grail. So we asked ourselves, could we try and find this diagnosis? We first started off by running this study. We published this a couple years ago now, where we looked at our PYP scans over the last 5 to 6 years. And what we found is we've been doing twice as many PYP scans trying to diagnose this disease, and the rate of positivity has remained the same. So this diagnosis that people have said is very rare, we don't actually think is that rare. We think somewhere between 100,000 and 1 million Americans have this diagnosis. They're just undiagnosed. And so we built a deep learning model very similar to ValveNet, where we looked for if we could detect cardiac amyloidosis from just pure electrocardiographic waveforms, or with the combination of echocardiographic data, electrocardiographic data, and a little bit of data from the electronic health record. And what we found is we're getting AUROCs of anywhere from 0.85 to 0.9. And so very similarly, we said, we want to test this prospectively. And so we are aiming to enroll 100 patients in the cardiac amyloidosis discovery trial, where we are trying to find patients with transthyretin cardiac amyloidosis. And here the stakes are a little higher. To diagnose these patients, we have to irradiate them. You know, with ValveNet, we just have to do an ultrasound of their heart. But here we think the stakes are higher, both for missing the diagnosis, but also trying to, you know, feel confident that we can bring in these patients. So we really are trying to put our money where our mouth is and say, it's one thing for these retrospective models to work. It's another thing to believe that prospectively we can find patients with this disease. To get to the idea also that we think we have lots of undiagnosed patients, we have over 2,000 patients who are above the age of 60 who've had an echo in our system in the last 3 years and who have an LV posterior or septal wall thickness of greater than 1.5 centimeters and have never undergone a PYP scan. This is a very, very thick wall to have. And there's really only 2 or 3 things that can cause it. Very bad hypertension for a long time, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, or infiltrative cardiomyopathies like cardiac amyloidosis. And we just know that some of these patients absolutely have cardiac amyloidosis. So do you need an AI model for this? Maybe. But one of the things is just about creating systematic approaches that allow us to take all the data that's in the health system and say, where are the patients who maybe fell through the cracks? And I think there's immense opportunity for AI to do stuff that clinicians can't, but also to just create organized systems where we can look at who fell through the cracks and where are things maybe patently obvious, but just we never got the patient to the right level of care. So we're very excited by where we're at right now. We're running multi-center retrospective validations with great institutions around the country. One of the things we've learned is to move the models, not the data, so that it is a lot easier for us to collaborate. Don't have to worry about onerous data use agreements that can take years to sign. We try to focus on clinical problems where we have personal expertise, and we really think we're working with authorities in the field because we want to ease adoption of deep learning version 1.0 in medicine. And we're running some of the first in world prospective clinical trials of deep learning because we really believe that we have to treat it like any other therapeutic drug or device. And we have to do these prospective clinical trials to figure out if this is going to help people. One of the last projects I want to talk with you about today is LVHNet. So chest x-rays remain the single most common diagnostic image of the heart in the world, but they almost never generate meaningful information about heart abnormalities. They tell us a lot about the lungs, but we've kind of been stuck with this one word that radiologists use to describe a big or abnormal heart, and that word is cardiomegaly. But cardiomegaly is kind of a useless diagnostic term. It doesn't lead to any clear information that we're going to act on. So in a lot of cases, we don't really know what to do when we say someone has cardiomegaly. It doesn't clearly trigger someone getting an echocardiogram or a repeat chest x-ray. So we're hoping that we can train an algorithm on chest x-ray images captured within a certain amount of time from echocardiograms to detect abnormality that radiologists can't. And specifically, we want to know if the walls of the heart are getting thick or if the chambers of the heart are getting dilated. And the reason for that is when people develop heart failure, first, they have structural abnormalities of the heart, like the walls getting thick or the chambers getting large, and then they develop symptoms. And the vast majority of patients today are not diagnosed with heart failure until they're symptomatic. And we call that stage C heart failure. What we were hoping is that we could diagnose heart failure before then and diagnose it when it's still stage B, when people have had cardiac structural abnormalities that are concerning, because then we could start treating patients sooner and take better care of them. So if we could do that, we could repurpose the most common imaging tests of the heart in the world as a screening tool for the most common cause of death in the world. So we did exactly this, and we looked for 3 labels: left ventricular hypertrophy, severe left ventricular hypertrophy, and a dilated left ventricle. So again, looking for thick walls or a dilated chamber. And we found AURCs ranging from 0.78 to 0.83. This was done on 40,000 chest x-rays done here at Columbia University over the course of the last 6 to 8 years. And we found AUPRCs anywhere from 0.32 to 0.55. And for the composite label, AUPRCs of around 0.5 to 0.6, depending on which composite we looked at. We worked with our collaborators at Stanford University, who were kind enough to take the CheckSpurt data set, which is a large publicly available data set. And then for a subset of those patients, they were able to actually generate the transthoracic echocardiographic data that we needed. And so we found for our composite label an AUROC of around 0.78 and 0.78 to 0.80 in our data set, and then around 0.76 on their data set. We also compared it to the diagnostic reads of radiologists here, and we found that our LVHNet model was more accurate, more precise, and had higher recall than radiologists just calling cardiomegaly for detecting abnormal cardiac structure. We're also really excited to say that we have 15 radiologists from around the country that are reading a subsample of our test set, 400 images, a combination from Columbia and Stanford. And the model is going to go head to head against those 15 radiologists, and we're going to see, does the model perform better, worse, or the same as these radiologists in trying to detect cardiac structural abnormality. We love to collaborate, and we want to make it as easy as possible for people to collaborate with us. And frankly, we just want to make it as easy as possible for people to do this sort of work. So myself and my PI, Adler Prott, we actually led a team of 5 master's students from the Data Science Institute. This was about 1.5 years ago now. And we created a full library for working through how to do deep learning on 12-lead electrocardiograms. It has basically everything. There's a chapter on how you extract this data if you're a health system and you have this data as either PDFs or XMLs from kind of the most commonly used vendor. If you don't have that, but you want to kind of create specific toy problems to work on, we even created a system where you can generate your own synthetic ECG data and manipulate it so that you have a way to very accurately test your models. And we walk through all the types of critical pre-processing to this data, which was really a huge part of my own postdoc, was kind of understanding how we should pre-process this sort of data, as well as a variety of models built in PyTorch or TensorFlow, as well as recurrent neural nets, LSTMs, CNNs, from DenseNet and ResNet to Inception. And then how do you kind of create a training infrastructure using Ignite and Optuna so that you can run lots of experiments and figure out what works best for your data set. So I want to take this last little bit of the talk to explore some of the problems that I think exist in the field right now and are exciting and meaningful. And so for me, these are the things that if I was a master's student or PhD student looking for meaningful, big projects to tackle on, these are some of the areas that I think for image-based artificial intelligence, particularly in medicine, you could have a huge impact. I love this picture. I'm sorry, I include it. When you type in robot doctor, this is one of the first pictures that shows up on Google. It seems like we probably have both software challenges and hardware challenges to figure out before AI really makes it in prime time in medicine. I think this guy, this little robot doctor here, is not making the most of his friends in medicine quite yet. So the first thing is multimodal machine learning. So right now, we really don't learn from patient priors very well. So oftentimes when you look at these ML models, they take a single electrocardiogram or a single CAT scan. But there's huge amounts of data that are available if you know patients' priors. In fact, there are certain diagnoses I, as a cardiologist, can't make unless I look at a prior image. And radiologists would tell you the same thing. So I've had many situations where someone is coming into the emergency room for a heart attack, and they have a very typical pattern for a heart attack on that electrocardiogram. But if they have that same exact pattern when they were asymptomatic a month ago, I know that it's not a heart attack. So knowing patient priors is critical to being able to answer certain questions. But right now, we kind of just completely blow them off. And there's a variety of reasons for this. The biggest reason being most models require data to be incorporated in a very, very specific size. And so it can't deal with the fact that this patient has 15 electrocardiograms and this patient has 1 electrocardiogram. Another part of that is the temporal component. What if you had 15 electrocardiograms, but they were all within the same 2 days because you were in the ICU, versus having 10 electrocardiograms, but they're over 10 years? How should the model effectively interpret that? And how should it handle the temporal variance that exists between that data? So most of these machine learning models that we're seeing in kind of medical AI just kind of sidestep this issue entirely. So how should model architecture evolve to handle this? Because I think there's immensely valuable data there. The second thing is we just don't learn from enough disparate data sources. So right now, these models often look at 1 or maybe 2 data sources, but for each patient, the answer may exist in a different place. So oftentimes, when I'm thinking about a patient and I'm evaluating them, the answer may be on an electrocardiogram, it may be on an echocardiogram, it may be on a CAT scan, or it may be somewhere in their other data, like their prior diagnoses or their laboratory data. And so when I'm evaluating a patient or I'm asked to consult on a patient, I have to look at all of that data in order to come to the correct answer, or what I believe to be the correct answer. So right now, most of these models aren't able to look at a wide variety of data sources. And on top of that, it's very hard to build models that adequately learn from very disparate data types, right? So if we think about the complexity of data, a CAT scan is probably something like 500 megabytes worth of data versus an electrocardiogram, which is about 1 megabyte of data, versus the electronic health record data on a patient, like their laboratory values, which is maybe 50 kilobytes of data. They're very, very different data with varying complexity. So if you try to use one learning rate or one model across all 3 of them, it can be very, very hard for that model to effectively learn from all of those data. So you can have very different gradient descents depending on what the data's complexity is. So how do you ensure one model adequately learns from all these disparate data types? You know, these are classic ensemble learning challenges, but there's a long way for us to go in doing this in medicine specifically. And how do we handle these kind of varying amounts of available data per patient when you have this added layer of complexity? So we have the temporal component, the multiplicity of availability per patient component, and then the complexity of different data types having different total sizes and thus probably requiring various learning rates. So we've seen interesting work around this. This comes from some of our colleagues at Stanford, where they looked at CT data, electronic health record data, and kind of a wide variety of things like ICD codes, lab tests, so on and so forth. And they did what I think a lot of us would do in that sort of situation. Let's just try a bunch of different things and see what works best. But when I talked with our colleagues, you know, they said, oh, in this specific case, early fusion seemed to work really well. But are they convinced that early fusion is always the answer? No, they think that it's probably just best specific to this data set for a variety of reasons. And I think a lot of times we are looking for a more disciplined, algorithmic, and methodologic approach rather than let's just try a bunch of different things and see what works specifically best for this data set. And so there's a need for kind of this bigger architecture and also this kind of methodologic or algorithmic approach of how do we assess various approaches and decide which one is best. Because right now, I think a lot of us out there are just trying a bunch of different things and seeing what works best in our specific use case. And I think we can do better than that. I also think we build hyper-specific models. So one of the things I learned from my work was, building a model just to look for valvular heart disease kind of sets you up for failure. because there's so many different pathologies that may exist that affect your signal to noise ratio. And really, what you want an AI model to do, in my opinion, in medicine, is not try to take away decision capacity from a physician. You don't want it to try and make a prediction that the physician can't ultimately decide is clearly right or not. You want it to work at a level where it can help bring to light things that may have been missed and fit within current guidelines. So all of our projects, really what they're trying to do is say, I think this pathology exists, and this is a pathology you wouldn't normally try to find on this imaging test. But if I have a certain level of confidence this pathology exists, why don't you get the confirmatory test that tells you whether or not I was right? Because it's low risk, and all I'm doing is helping bring to light something that you would otherwise agree with. If you knew the patient had a dilated left ventricle, you would get an echo. So I'm just trying to tell you, I think that thing exists from these cheaper modalities. So with that in mind, I think there's a lot of value in trying to build more general models. So instead of just looking for valvular heart disease, can I build a model that tells me anything that I would be concerned about enough to get an echocardiogram exists on this ECG? And there's a wide variety of diagnoses. And the reason this is valuable is it increases that positive predictive value, or that prevalence of disease, and thus makes the model much more likely to be successful in the real world. Problem is, this doesn't always work. So we tried to add additional diagnosis for LVHNet, and then we watched the overall performance of the model plummet. It was really bad at this specific diagnosis, and it drew down all of the performance of the other diagnoses. So there has to be some sort of kind of give and take here of how do we build models that are more general, but are still very successful. And the last part of this is kind of saliency mapping. So can we learn from these models? For me, one of the holy grails would be a model does something a physician can't. By using saliency mapping techniques, we fully understand what the model is learning from, and then we're able to teach it back to a physician and thus create a new thing that physicians can look for and diagnose. That would be kind of an amazing thing to be able to do. The problem is a lot of saliency mapping techniques right now, I think, are very limited. They're very limited in using with one-dimensional data, like multi-channel electrocardiograms. And I think even for two-dimensional data, they leave a lot of unanswered questions. So for an electrocardiogram, or when your heart beats, these are the electrical activities. There's a P wave, then a QRS, and a T wave. And this is the top chambers of your heart depolarizing, the bottom chambers of your heart depolarizing, and then the bottom part of your heart repolarizing. And these are kind of like the major things. And then, you know, we call the PR interval and all this sort of stuff, but P, Q, R, S, T. Also, a fun little fact, the reason this is called P, Q, R, S, T is it's a Cartesian system, like Cartesian coordinates. And so O stands for origin, right? So it starts with an O because that's the origin or the flat line. And then they just went P, Q, R, S, T. Okay, that's all the important stuff a heart does. We're done. And they did that 100 years ago, and we've just stuck with it, right? So maybe we're due for a little bit of an update. So when we look at electrocardiograms, you know, as a cardiologist, I learn all of these patterns, right? So for left ventricular hypertrophy, I'm looking at this channel and I'm looking to see, is this bigger than this? And is this greater than 18 millimeters? And is this 23 millimeters? And this is the Sokolov-Lyon index. And this is just one way we diagnose LVH. You know, we look at amplitude, we look at width, and we look at the kind of total pattern. And this is a classic pattern. We call this an S1 Q3 T3. And this is a sign that someone may or may not have had a blood clot in their lungs. And, you know, every med student learns this. And so what would be exciting is, could we learn an S1 Q3 T3 type pattern from machine learning? And we even get odds ratios associated with these, right? So we quantify what is the risk of someone having a pathology if this exists. So that's what, you know, we look for right now. And that's, as clinicians, what we're hoping for. But this is kind of what we have. So this is, you know, whether you use SHAP or Lyme or GradCam, I think the challenges exist. So this was running SHAP on our ValveNet model. And, you know, it basically, blue pulls it towards a negative diagnosis, red pulls it towards a positive classification. And I'm saying, okay, it really focuses on the QRS, and maybe the T wave is important, but I have no idea how to interpret this. I don't know if it cares about the amplitude or the shape. I don't care. I don't know if why it matters so much more in lead V6 versus these other leads. I'm left with more questions than answers. And this is a really wonderful paper by some of our colleagues at NYU, where they built an adversarial model. And what they basically did is they built a model that could accurately detect atrial fibrillation versus normal sinus rhythm. And then they built an adversarial network that created perturbations, which they then added to the electrocardiogram. So here's the original tracing. Here's the perturbation. And then their model went from being 100% confident that this was atrial fibrillation to 100% confident that this was normal, which is incorrect. And they did the same thing in the opposite direction. So normal, 99% confident, and then atrial fibrillation, 100% confident, which is incorrect. This scares the crap out of me because I want to believe that these models are looking at this data in the same way I am, right? They're looking at how much space is there between the QRSs and is it regular? But when I see stuff like this, it tells me I don't know the first thing about what these models are actually learning and what are the features that are salient to it. And so I think we have a really, really long way to go. I think this is not only true for one-dimensional data, but two-dimensional data. So this is our LVHNet model. And here's 100 chest x-rays with 100 grad cams next to it. And we can see 100 times it's focused on the heart and not other parts of the chest. So that's great. It's consistently, classifying true positives by looking at the heart. But the label is left ventricular hypertrophy. And really the left ventricle on a chest x-ray is just this little sliver here. So why is it looking at this entire heart if all it needs to look at is this? And we think the answer there has to do with the fact that we're only looking at the last layer of GradCam. And the problem is by the time you get to this final layer, you have greatly condensed the total image size. So if you start with a 244 by 244 image, by the time you're at your final normalization labor from something like DenseNet 121, it's basically a 32 by 32 image. And so what you end up having is GradCam getting stretched back over that, but it's going to be inherently diffuse. So what we are kind of interested in seeing is if we look at the dense blocks, which is the combination of all the dense layers, right, with skip connections included. When we look at the dense block, we see a very different story, right, which is it's very focused on the periphery of the hearts. And it's much more interested in where the left ventricle is. And so we kind of consistently see this pattern, and then it blooms out to the entire heart. So even these GradCam figures that we see in all these kind of medical AI studies, I'm very hesitant to understand or trust them because they're looking at one interpretation of the images, but there can be many other ways to look at this and try and get a meaningful piece of information. And we see this sort of pattern, for hundreds and hundreds of our chest x-rays when we look. So I just want to conclude with a couple of thoughts. I think deep learning can profoundly improve medicine. I think you need to pick problems that need solving. And I think that's where your clinical colleagues are really important. They have to be things that actually matter and people need solved and not just fit your method. And you have to make sure it's not a workflow problem. If logistic regression is 90% as good and isn't being used, beware. Find problems where the method can uniquely solve it in ways that current methodologies can't. And we need better tools. We need faster, simpler, more reliable experimentation and validation. And we need better ways to understand our models when possible. And lastly, I remember what it's like to have been a grad student twice, both as a medical student and as a researcher. And I know it can be very lonely and it can be very hard to figure out what matters and what doesn't matter. And are you doing a good job and are you making progress? But what I want you to know is you can have a huge impact. And I really mean that. Small teams can work at a huge scale with good oversight and infrastructure. And there's really this amazing opportunity to make medicine better. There are things we do in medicine that are so advanced, and then there are places where we just are stumbling over ourselves, and we need people with technical talent. There are a lot of projects where you can have an impact quickly. We're running 2 prospective clinical trials, and we're figuring out ways to automate this so that it runs prospectively on every patient as they come into the hospital. And so there are these opportunities to do stuff that can have an impact today, and really see it in the course of your PhD or your master's project. And things change more than we realize. I think there's this actual long history of risk-taking in medicine. And sometimes we just kind of think, well, it's the status quo, or it's too dangerous to do this, or no one would trust this. But no, there's all sorts of things that we use on a daily basis right now that people would have thought it was nuts, a decade ago. And so there is this kind of perpetual movement forward. We just have to remind ourselves and believe in it and realize we can be a part of it. So thank you so much for having me. We are hiring. If any of this is interested, please reach out to me. This is my email, it's my Twitter handle. We would love to talk more, love to buy you a coffee. We are looking for people with wide varieties of talents. And I just want to say a huge thank you to my collaborators and mentors. I really couldn't have done any of this without them. I've been so lucky to be in Adler-Pratt's lab and to have Tim Porteruca as kind of like my co-captain in all this work, and a wide variety of other people who've kind of made this happen. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elias. I think it's Valentine's Day and we could all use a little bit of help with our hearts. So I certainly felt my heart warmed from this presentation. And so I had a few questions. I think, like first, I heard you put a pan on someone's heart the other day. What was that about? Is that true? Like a frying pan in a hospital? I've never heard about that.
I did do that. Yes, this got a little popular on Twitter. Let's see. Maybe if I pull up the picture, it'll make a little more sense. So I serve in a variety of different roles in the hospital, and so sometimes I'm on electrophysiology consults. We're heart rhythm doctors, and so at Columbia, we take care of the sickest patients. And so this patient has a left ventricular assist device. So they literally have a magnetic levitating motor that is helping push blood out of their heart. And they also have an ICD, which is like a pacemaker that can shock them. The problem is these two devices interfere with each other a lot. And so to interrogate his ICD, we had to make a Faraday cage. And I kid you not, this is one of the official ways to do it. We have a device rep who comes by and they have a Lodge cast iron pan. And so we put a lead apron and then a cast iron pan. And sometimes we even wrap the braided coil in aluminum foil to try and create a Faraday cage and minimize the interference. So sometimes, like I said, we do very high tech things and sometimes we do very low tech things.
So it's not just deep learning architecture, it's physical Faraday cage architecture too. I love that. I also see that Sam, you have your hand raised. Do you want to go ahead with your question, please?
Sure. Hi, and thank you so much for the talk. My name is Sam. I'm actually a doctoral student in the Department of Epidemiology here, and my studies focus on social epidemiology in particular. So when you talk about bringing in different kinds of data into the models, and you're showing all the different kinds of things we could get from a health record, my brain is already thinking, oh, well, what is the next level of data that could come in terms of understanding people's everything associated with where they live and perhaps their lived experience and things like that from an even sociological perspective. However, my question, and you can comment on that or my question, either one, was what kinds of processes are built into your pipelines with respect to algorithmic fairness and ethics and that kind of thing? Because so much of what we've seen in the AI world is that we have a bunch of really smart people using data as their playground. And then after the fact, another group of really smart people come in and say, hey, did you consider this? And did you consider that? And are these models replicating health disparities and so on and so forth? So I'm wondering if your group is doing anything in terms of being very proactive about that aspect in terms of anticipating those potential harms and ethical questions in the pipelines, essentially.
I'm so glad you asked. And Jaan was actually one of the people who really kind of guided me through this when I was kind of struggling and thinking about it. So one, this is why it's really, I think, valuable to get people from a bunch of different perspectives and people who kind of experience what it is you're trying to solve on a day-to-day basis. So, cardiac amyloid is a disease that in our population here at Columbia, people who walk through the door, it should be, predominantly Black and Caribbean Hispanic patients. And when you look at who walks through the door, it's Black and Caribbean Hispanic people. When you look at who gets like electrocardiograms and echocardiograms, kind of like the standard, more boilerplate cardiac tests, it's Caribbean Hispanic and Black patients. And then you look at who gets a pyrophosphate scan or looks for cardiac amyloidosis or makes it to Matt Maurer's clinic. He's our cardiac amyloidosis expert. And it's all white people. And Matt's like, what is going on? Like, he's like, why is my clinic all white when I know this disease has a higher prevalence in Black and Caribbean Hispanic patients, and our patient population is Black and Caribbean Hispanic? So I think that you have to always think about these sorts of things, and you have to think about what is your AI model really learning, and how are things where are places where it can be dangerous. But I am of the belief that good AI models can actually be anti-racist. So our current clinical care is racist, right? The people who are most likely to suffer from this disease don't seem to be getting diagnosed. So what we're actually doing is we're looking at all the patients who are at high risk for this disease based off of a variety of criteria. We're building a model that we know is definitively fair for people who are Black versus non-Black. And then we want to run the model prospectively on all those people who kind of fit in the high risk bucket category. And then look at what's the average risk score of those patients amongst Black patients, non-Black patients, Hispanic patients, non-Hispanic patients. And what we think is the model is going to be like, hey, I think you have a bunch more undiagnosed Black people with this disease. So I think part of it is you always have to be careful. But I don't poo-poo AI for this. I actually think there are just places where physiology should trump pathways of care, right? And the model can just look at this and say, from a physiologic standpoint, hey, this person just looks like they have cardiac amyloid. One of the things that's really important to us, though, is we never include race or ethnicity in as data that our model learns from. Like, that's never an input. Partially because it's really messy and really bad. Like, the data that we have, the quality, I think, is poor. And we just don't want the model to be keying in on that. But we do want to build models that we believe are fair across different races. And so that's one of the things that we do. So, we're kind of taking this first foray into equalized odds and seeing how it's going to work and seeing what's the trade-off there. But thank you for asking that, because I think it's a great point.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, I think that's
Oh, Jaan, I think you're muted.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to say thank you so much, Pierre. And I know you offered to buy somebody an email if they buy somebody a coffee if they email you. So I've done that, and I recommend you do that as well if you're interested in this work. Pierre is awesome. So thank you again, Dr. Elias, and hope to see you back here sometime soon.
Thank you guys so much.